Amen. Well, this is week 2 in the Samson record. So we're in Judges 14 today. We're going to start in Judges 13. But, before we do, I've got to say something about the study that I've been doing on this chapter, because I frankly have been upset, scandalized, hurt for God at the misjudgments of some of the commentators. Did Samson, visit a prostitute? Yes, he did. Did Samson love a woman in the valley of Sorek who was a Philistine woman? Yes, he did. But was his sin any greater than David's, who committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah? Was his sin any greater than Solomon, who had 1,000 women? Was his sin any greater than Gideon, who had 70 sons because he had so many wives? If you pick up a commentary to read about Samson, I want to caution you, because people, especially more liberal theologians, don't get the Spirit of God. They don't get the heart of God. They don't see God working. I was really blessed this week. I subscribed to Christianity Today. Most of you know that. I talk about it regularly. I think my new Christianity Day came in the mail. They had this nifty article in here. I don't know if you can see I'll see if I can get in front of the camera. I don't know, but it says of sex and men. That's what it says. And they had this paragraph in here that I thought was beautifully worded. It says, the church is beginning to grasp how purity culture objectifies women and dehumanizes them. What's often less appreciated is the way the movement also dehumanized men. And a purity culture dehumanized women. If purity culture dehumanized women by treating them as sex objects, it dehumanized men by casting them as sexual animals. If it has hypersexualized women's bodies, it hypersexualized men's minds. Much of our rhetoric and resources adopted the culture's assumption that men are helplessly and hopelessly hypersexual. And I think that's really true. I mean, when I was studying the book of Ruth, I was blown away to find the number of commentators that think that when Ruth went down to the threshing floor and lay down next to Boaz and said, spread your covering over me, that she seduced Boaz and had sex with him, and that's why he married her, which makes her look like a slut and makes him like an oversexed idiot. And I thought, when I read the first commentary that said that, I thought, this has got to be like just the most far out commentary. Surely this is the only one of these on the planet. And then you find out that commentary after commentary, the modern ones, the ones that are influenced by the culture around us, just said that over and over. And I was like, good grief. Is there anybody there that understands how a biblical man takes a stance on principle, just like a biblical woman does? Ruth would no longer just no more, knowing what she said about Yahweh and being her God and that kind of thing. She would no more go down to seduce an innocent man than Boaz would just go and all of a sudden jump on Ruth and make love to her. I mean, it's just not the way godly people behave. Godly people have boundaries. And yet, I read these commentaries about Judges, and it's well, Samson was out of bounds. He was out of control. He disobeyed God. He ignored his parents. And they miss the whole heart. And I thought to myself, these men they don't speak. You can't possibly walk by the Spirit. I think none of these guys must speak in tongues. None of these guys must understand what it is to be powerfully moved by the Spirit, because when they're looking at it in the text, they don't recognize it for what it is. And so once again, I think I don't say this very often, but boy, when it comes to the Samson record, the best commentary that I've ever found on the Samson is the one that we're writing ourselves, because we understand the movement of the Spirit of God. We understand what it is to be a man of God, a woman of God. We understand what it is to fight daily against the culture when nobody's standing with you. And we see that in Samson. And I want to remind us again, Judges chapter 13, verse 25, the last verse of Judges chapter 25. It says, and the spirit of Yahweh began to stir him up in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So when Samson was just a young man, God began to work in him. And he would have known that. I mean, most of you when I'm looking at your faces on the screen, most of you, I know you have felt the Spirit of God moving in you. I know that you've had times where you say to yourself, that thought was not me. That thought was God. Or that action was not me. That was God. That direction was not me. That was God. When the Spirit of God is stirring in you and you're spiritually sensitive, you know it. You may miss a couple times, but you know it. And it's ridiculous for these commentators to read that Yahweh is stirring up Samson and then to write that Samson knew nothing about it, but God was taking this unwilling, willful, selfish subject and working his will through him. And that's the kind of crap I've been reading and studying the book of Samson. And, we can't believe that. We've got to look at the text, see what it's teaching us, and believe it. And when it says the spirit of Yahweh began to stir him up in Mahanadan, he did. And if we look at Judges chapter 15, please, the very last verse in Judges chapter 15, here's a mind blower for you. The very last verse in Judges 15 says, and he, Samson, judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. But I defy you now. Remember that there's more written about Samson the judge than any other judge in the book of Judges. I defy you to find one place where anybody went to him for advice. It says he judged Israel, and yet in de facto, he did not. He wasn't like Deborah, where people came and got advice and that kind of thing. How does he judge Israel? Well, back to Judges chapter 14. Let's go to the very first verse. In Judges 13, in the very first verse, it says, the children of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. And it was so evil that Yahweh gave them into the hand of the Philistines. So in contrast to the Israelites, who were steeped in idolatry, steeped in weird sexual practices, steeped in disobedience to God, Samson was taking a stand and trying to do what God wanted. He was trying to get the Philistines out of Israel. The way he went about it is a little bit, unorthodox, but he was trying to do the will of God and get the the Philistines gone. And frankly, in his lifetime, he did a hell of a lot better job than the other Israelites who were doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that's what it means to be a judge. When you've got the Spirit of God and you walk by the Spirit of God and you do the will of God to the best of your ability, even if it looks unorthodox, from God's perspective, you're the spiritual person in the kingdom. So we could look at Samson from the inside out and say, Judges chapter 15 has to be wrong. He never judged Israel, but God said he did. And he had the Spirit of God and he walked by the Spirit of God. And that's what it takes to be one of God's men, be one of God's women, to have the Spirit and walk by that Spirit. And he really did. And so we go to Judges chapter 14, and we'll continue to read the record and watch the interaction between the flesh and the spirit. So Samson goes down to Timnah. Now he lives between Zorah and Eshtaol, so he's gone about 5 miles downhill. And he sees a woman in Timnah, the daughter of the Philistines. Came up and told his father and his mother, and I read this last week, so I'm going to go through it quick. And said, I've seen a woman in Timnah, the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. His father and his mother said, is there not a woman among the daughters of your brothers, among all my people? You go to take a wife of the Philistines. But Samson said, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. And there's a double entendre there. It's not that Samson in his flesh was lying. He felt like she was a wonderful woman. But at the same time, he understood the contest between the Israelites and the Philistines. And that's why it says his father and his mother didn't know that this was from Yahweh, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. And this phrase, that Samson was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines, then is going to frame the rest of his existence. If you look at what he does, he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. The way he did it was his own way, was a little unorthodox, and brings the wrath of the commentators down on him. When he calls himself a servant and prays to God in chapter 15, I read commentaries today that said that he was not a servant, that he was self promoting, and that he wasn't a true. It's like, wait a minute, excuse me. Who are you to judge Samson? Do you have the Spirit of God? Do you walk by the Spirit of God? Do you fight with and risk your life to deliver God's people? These commentators blew me away. I'm sorry, I'm mad at the commentators today. Anyway, so it says he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. Then the next verse, or the next phrase. Now at that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. That's another phrase we've got to hang on to. That's a kind of an overarching thing. So we're setting the context. The context is the Israelites were supposed to drive out the Philistines. They failed miserably. Now, not only are the Philistines ruling over them, but the Israelites have made peace with that. They're not even trying to get delivered from the Philistines. They're not even trying to take the promised land. And God's raising up Samson, and he's going to seek an occasion against the Philistines because the Philistines are ruling over Israel and occupying God's land. So verse 5, Samson went down and his father and his mother to Timnah, and he came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. And, lions don't eat grapes. So, the fact that the lion was there, this is a demonic setup. And you're going to watch God here turn a lemon into a lemonade. Our adversary, the devil, in Peter, it says he walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. The adversary is always looking to get us. Now, here's Samson. Does the adversary know that Yahweh is working in Samson, stirring him up, teaching him, training him, guiding him along? Of course. The adversary's got his eye on Samson. From the time the angel came down and talked to Samson's parents, the devil's got little demon spies out going, wait a minute, that's an angel. He's talking to those people. So Samson was a marked man. And if you're the devil, when do you want to move against some of God's people? When they're young and inexperienced. So here goes Samson. He's walking down towards Timnath. The adversary's like, I'm going to kill this guy before his ministry gets started. And so here comes the lion to kill Samson. And now this puts God on the spot. God could say, oops, I'm going to let Samson get killed. But he raised Samson up to fight the Philistines. So here, I love the way it's worded here. It says, the young lion came roaring toward him, verse 6, but the Spirit of Yahweh, here's the great fight, the devil bringing the lion, God bringing the power of the Spirit, the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him, meaning he could feel that infusion of energy, he could feel that energy, that power. But look at the conflict. It's 3,000 years. This is 3,000 years before us, actually more than 3,000 years before you and I, and yet today it's the same conflict. The adversary's throwing stuff at us and we get energized by the Spirit of God and go right at it. It's the same conflict. But then you start looking at, well, where are the other Israelites? Why aren't they down there helping? Oh, well, they've made peace with the enemy. Sometimes I think to myself, where are all the other Christians? Why are there so few Christians that really take the battlefield? Well, they've made peace with the enemy. They're going to just have their little comfortable life and believe in Christ. And that's not the life I want to live. I want to be in this battle. I love this stuff. Is it tough? Yes, it's tough. but it's where God is trying to move, to take back territory. We pray to take back people from the devil, to bring them into the faith. That's what we're doing. We're taking back territory. That's what Samson was up to. So the spirit of Yahweh, verse 6, rushed upon him. And although he had nothing in his hand, he tore it apart as where one would tear apart a young goat. And you guys can't, I can't even imagine what that took. Lions are just, they're killing machines. No question about it. A full-grown male lion is a killing machine. And the Spirit of God, he just tears it apart. And what an amazing miracle. To write that Samson would somehow not realize that God was working in him, I don't even know how you could write that. I really honestly don't. And then it says, but he didn't tell his father or his mother what he had done. Now, the Bible doesn't explain why he didn't tell his father or mother what he had done. I think for whatever reason, there was something going on where he didn't want to. It may be that he just, when he went to tell him or he went to talk about it, it was just like, and you guys know what it's like to have something to tell somebody, and then you're going to tell them, and it's just like something in the spirit puts the brakes on it, and you just don't say it. I can't prove that that's what happened here with Samson, but I can prove is that later on, it becomes very important that he didn't tell his mother and his father. Now, I can tell you what the commentators say. The commentators say that Samson ate honey from the carcass of the lion. And we know that, we'll see that coming up. And that because Samson ate honey from the carcass of the lion, the honey was unclean, and Samson gave it to his mother and father, making them unclean. And so he didn't care about his mother and father, and he didn't care about his Nazirite vow. And frankly, he just went around willfully doing whatever he wanted. And I think that's a bunch of junk. And we'll get into that here in a minute. So anyway, he didn't tell his mother and his father. Verse 7. Then he went down and spoke to the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. And I think that this is a kind of a combination that he knows he's seeking an occasion against the Philistines. He really likes this woman. He's not sure how all this is going to work out. I'm sure he didn't know how it was going to work out, but that's how he was moving forward. Verse 8, after a while, he returned to take her. So at some point, he went down, he spoke to the woman, and he had to go home, 5 miles, 6 miles back up the valley, closer to the heartland of Judah, Dan in this case, and Ephraim, Judah. He goes marching up, and then verse 8, there's going to be after a while, he returns to take her. He comes back down, making the trip down the valley to meet with his girlfriend in Timnah. And he turned aside to see the remains of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the carcass of the lion and honey. Verse 9, and he scooped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly how he did this. I had bees for 4 years of my life. I kept bees. And I know that if you just stick your hand into a beehive, you are going to have massive problems. It's just that simply is not the way to get anything profitably done, except get yourself stung and possibly, depending on the size of the hive, even possibly stung to death. The standard thing that beekeepers do is they have a smoker, and they blow up. You make a really dense smoke, and you poof it into the hive, and two things happen. Some of the bees leave, but a lot of the bees think there's going to be a forest fire, and so by instinct, what they do is they completely lose their focus on anything that's going on around them, and they begin eating honey as fast as they possibly can. So you have all these bees that just swarm to the honey and stick to it, and they're going to eat as much honey as they can, because if there's a real fire, then the honey's all going to be gone, and that's what they need to survive through the winter. so they can always go somewhere else and regurgitate it. So anyway, that's what I think happened. The Bible is going to collapse time here because it says when he scooped some out with his hand, that he probably built a fire just upwind of the beehive and then threw a bunch of green leaves and stuff on it and made this big cloud of smoke, and all the bees either left or calmed down, and then he could scoop some out of the carcass of the lion. So verse 9, he scooped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. Now, you'll read many commentators that'll say, this honey was unclean because it was in or what Samson did was unclean because it was in the carcass of a lion. I don't think that's true at all. If you read Leviticus and if you read Deuteronomy, and both Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, it makes it clear that bees are unclean. So you can't eat bees. They're unclean. But bees are all over the honey all the time. So if an unclean animal touching the honey makes the honey unclean, then honey would be unclean. But it's clearly not unclean. Honey is Levitically okay to eat, which tells me that the honey can be in contact with something that's unclean and not be unclean itself. And so, I don't think Samson would break his Nazirite vow, and I don't think that Samson would dishonor his mother and father by giving them something unclean and then not telling them about it. So anyway, he goes and he scoops out this honey, and he went on eating as he went. And by the way, when it says in verse 8, after a while he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the remains of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the carcass of the lion and honey. I probably don't need to tell you that would be extremely rare. Bees would not normally swarm up inside the carcass of an animal, and particularly, in here, the carcass of a lion. So what we see here behind the scenes is the invisible hand of God. Now, when it first happened, you're thinking, okay, God, I'm pretty sure you brought those bees into the carcass of the lion. What are you doing? Well, God knows who Samson is, and God knows what Samson's temperament is. We're going to learn as we continue to read through the chapters about Samson that Samson had an exaggerated sense of humor. He had to have a good sense of humor because he was alone so much of the time. He wasn't supported by anybody. There's not a single record in the scripture where he had a friend. And so he leaned on his sense of humor. As we learn in the text, he leaned on it too much, and it eventually led into harm to him. Interestingly enough, what we see in the life of Jesus Christ is we see humor, but we don't see him overly lean on it to the point that it hurts him. And one of the lessons that we learned from Samson is each and every one of us has personality traits. Some people are more serious. Some people are more lighthearted. Some people are laid back. Some people are more a personality and they're driven. La, 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 la. You can't escape your personality trait, but you need to be aware of your personality traits. You need to be aware of how you are. You need to be aware of how you come off to others. A good way to do that is to ask people, but then they've got to be honest with you. And a lot of times they don't want to hurt your feelings, so they lie. So you got to find honest people that you can talk to and say, how do I come across? And if they say, well, frankly, you're a little harsh. Okay, thank you for the feedback. That kind of stuff. Samson leaned on his humor. God would have known that. He's going to use this in Samson now to exacerbate a coming against the Philistines. So God does this bee thing to work in and with Samson to come against the Philistines. So he's scooping out with his hands. He's eating as he goes. He comes to his father and mother, gives some to them. They ate. He didn't tell them the honey came out of a carcass of a lion. Verse 10, And his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, as the young men were accustomed to do, because this is going to be a wedding feast. And of course, there were, wedding feasts are according to custom. Verse 11, when they saw him, they brought 30 companions who remained with him. So Samson was a large, powerful man, even on his own. But I don't care how large and powerful you aren't going to grab a lion and tear it apart with your hands by your natural strength. And we're going to see over and over again, God empowered Samson. He would have known that. But the Philistines saw him. They brought 30 companions to be with him. Then Samson said to them, now let me tell you a riddle. Okay, so this is Samson's personality. What's working in him? He's seeking an occasion against the Philistines. And it says in verse 4, we want to go back up to verse 4 and read it again. In verse 4, it says the last phrase, now at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. That becomes very important here in this riddle, because Samson, the Israelite, is going to go to these Philistines and he's going to say, I have a riddle. So verse 12 again. So Samson said, now let me tell you a riddle. If you can tell yes, tell it to me within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot tell it to me, then you must give me 30 garments, 30 linen garments, and 30 changes of clothing. The linen garments are what you and I know as underclothes. Remember, they would have a tunic, a set of maybe a top and bottom tunic, or just a one-piece tunic that was like a super long undershirt. And that would be the linen garments. When it talks about that, that would be the inner clothing. And then the changes of clothing, the 30 linen garments, 30 underclothes, 30 changes of clothing, that's the outer robes and the accoutrements that go with the outer robes. So this is 30 complete outfits. And he says to them, you've got to, if you can't tell it to me, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. And they said to him, tell us your riddle that we may hear it. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that Samson knew that he was creating a high stakes game. When we're talking about seeking an occasion against the Philistines, he could have said, if you guys can solve it, then I'll give you one change of clothing. And if you can solve it, you give me one. This is 30 complete wardrobes is a lot of money. And Samson here knows he's putting the Philistines in a vice because they're ruling over Israel. They're supposed to be the masters of Israel. In the honor-shame society of the biblical culture, for an underling to go and put a riddle to people that are ruling over him, the Philistines really had no honorable way to turn this down. And Samson knew it. He put him in a vice. And my gut feeling is that he thought they wouldn't be able to solve it, and that they were going to be completely embarrassed, and he was going to be the recipient of a whole bunch of money. 30 changes of garments, you could sell that for a lot. So I can't prove it, but my gut feeling is that at this point in time, he didn't see how this was going to play out. He figured, he may have even thought this bees thing is so rare that has to be from the Lord. But in any case, he says, you're going to give me 30 changes of garments, or I'll give you 30 changes of garments. Now, if you ask Samson, just out of curiosity, how many changes of garments do you have to give away? He probably would have said none, but I'm not going to lose this. Are you kidding? They're never going to figure this out. How often have you ever seen honeybees in the carcass of a lion? They're not going to figure this out. And I think that's what he was thinking about. So in any case, they said, tell us your riddle that we may hear it. And they're basically forced into this by their position as rulers and in the honor-shame society that they live in. So he said to them, verse 14, out of the eater came forth food to eat. Out of the strong came, something sweet. And in 3 days, they could not tell him the riddle. Verse 15, and it came to pass on the 4th day. Now, if you're reading a King James Version or some of the other versions, it'll say 7th day. The Masoretic text says 7th day, but it's been long recognized that that does not work really well with the timing of the feast. The Septuagint and Aramaic Targums say 4th day. And the difference in Hebrew between the word 4th and the word 7th is a very, very tiny letter. So it's pretty certain here that there was a textual mistake made in copying the text, and that the proper reading is in the REV and explained in the commentary. Came to pass on the 4th day. They realized after 3 days, they don't have a clue what this riddle is about. So they go to on the 4th day. They said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. And then this last phrase, have you all called us to take our property? Almost all the versions say, have you called us to take our property? But there's a shift in the number, if you will, of the word you, because when it says it came to pass on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband. The word your is singular, or else we will burn you. The word is singular, and your father's house with fire. Have you, plural, called us to take our property? What the Philistines are saying here is, you and your family and Samson have put this riddle together, and you all have plotted to take our property from us. In other words, you, woman, we don't even know her name, and your family have now sided with the Israelites against us. You are enemies of the Philistine nation, and you've brought us here just so all of you can take our property away. And we're not going to put up with that. We're going to put you to death. So that shows you how intense this thing is. When Samson said, we'll wager 30 changes of garments and 30 underclothes, then he knew that he was creating a high stakes game. And sometimes in our ministry and walk, we've got to put pressure on the other people. I know it's not favorable to talk to somebody that you're witnessing to about, look, this is not a game. God created us so that we could serve him. And if you don't serve him, the Bible has actually much more to say about the lake of fire than it does about heaven, which is true. How many times did Christ mention heaven versus how many times did he mention the lake of fire? It's destruction in the lake of fire is a reality. And sometimes we need to up our ante, and it's a walk by the Spirit, but we can't be afraid to pull out that kind of card when we're talking to people. And here the Philistines, they're going to be flat out honest. Your whole situation here, all you guys have plotted together to steal our property. That means you're aligning yourself with the Israelite nation. If you can't figure out how to get this riddle, the information about this riddle, we're going to kill you and your family off. So then obviously Samson's wife takes this very seriously. So verse 16, Samson's wife wept before him and said, you surely hate me and do not love me. You've told a riddle to the children of my people and have not told it to me. And interestingly enough, one of the things we know in the satanic world is that when people are satanic, when they're unbelieving, it's very common that they will accuse you of doing what they're doing. We see this in politics all the time, where politicians will accuse another politician of doing something when in fact they're the ones that are actually doing it. This is exactly what we're seeing here. She says, you surely hate me and do not love me. Actually, she hated Samson. She was only getting the information so she could betray him. And it was Samson that loved her and was faithful to her. But she turns that around. This is something, whenever we're dealing with demonic, desperate people, We have to take what they say and say, is this honestly about me, or is it about them? So here she says, you hate me. You do not love me. All lies. She hated him because she was going to turn him in, which of course we know she did. You've told the riddle of the children of my people and have not told it to me. And he said to her, behold, I have not told it to my father or my mother. And should I tell you? And all of a sudden, the fact that he hadn't told his mother and father comes right to the fore. Because does he love his mom and dad? Of course he loves his mom and dad. So it goes without saying, I love my mom and dad and I haven't told them. So how can you say, if I don't tell you, that means I don't love you? That you see how that works? So he's using the mom and dad as proof that he can still love her, even though he hasn't told her the riddle. And she's the one that's lying and turned things upside down. Verse 17, and she wept before him the 7 days while the feast lasted, which was the rest of the 4th day, the 5th day, the 6th day, the 7th day. She's weeping and unhappy for 4 solid days. And so it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she pressed him hard. And then what'd she do? She hated him. She told the riddle to the children of her people. Verse 18. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, which is a great ploy on their part. They wait until, when it's sunset, the 7th day ends. So they wait till the last possible second. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Now, when you are plowing, you have a goad, which is a long pointed stick, and you poke the animal with it to make them behave. And especially with heifers, young cattle, you have to, they want to go back to the stall. They want to sit down, take a rest. They want to go to the right. They want to go to the left. So you're incessantly poking them and trying to talk to them. And so what this is if you hadn't threatened my young wife with some kind of pain, you would not have found out my riddle. And then so what does he do now? He needs 30 changes of garments, And so verse 19, once again, under God's guidance, this is not his own brain idea. This is God's guidance. And the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him. So the Spirit of God fills him, word of knowledge, word of wisdom. What do I do? Where do I go? He goes down to Ashkelon. It's about 25 miles to the southwest. And he struck down 30 men of them and took their spoil and gave the changes of clothing to those who had told the riddle. So and when he killed them, he didn't bring the clothing back with blood stains all over him. So he didn't stab them to death. He didn't bludgeon them to death. He probably just simply went up to them, grabbed them, twisted their neck, and that was the end of that, and then took off their clothing. And so, it's going to take a while for the people of Ashkelon to figure what in the world happened here. 25 naked bodies, all with broken necks. What happened? But word will eventually get back, because it'll come back from Timnath that, hey, Samson just showed up with 30 changes of garments. Where do you think he would have gotten them? Because there isn't a lot. 25 miles in those days is a fairly long time. It's at least one solid day's walk. It could be broken even up into 2. So it's going to take a while for word to get back, but eventually they're going to figure that out. So he struck down the men, took their spoil, gave the changes of clothing to those who had told the riddle. And then this interesting statement, and his anger was kindled. He felt so betrayed. When we talk about these men and women of God, we have to put ourselves, in their place. And Samson was legitimately betrayed by a girl that he legitimately loved and that he married. She was his wife, because it says Where did it get off to? Verse 16. So Samson's wife wept before him. Verse 15. They said to Samson's wife, he had married this girl. He was expecting her to be faithful. And frankly, he was expecting them to lose the bet in him just to get a lot of money, a lot of changes of clothing. And this is totally different. His anger was kindled. He was upset. He was angry, and he went up to his father's house. Normally, in a situation like this, in a wedding, you get a wedding, and then the man takes the woman home. But here, he was so mad at her and his family and her family that he left her there. And then at that point, verse 20, Samson's wife's father and mother, mainly the father, would just say, what are we going to do? Samson's really mad. He's probably given up on us. He's probably not coming back. And so they simply gave Samson's wife to his companion who had accompanied him. This is not moral, and this is not legal. You can't simply give somebody's wife to somebody else, even if she is your daughter. And it's not moral. They could have sent messengers. Samson only lives 5 miles up the valley. That 5 miles, good grief. What's that, a 2-hour walk or something? So I mean, they could have sent somebody to Samson's house and said, is the marriage over? What are we doing here? But they didn't even do that. So what they do here is it's immoral. Frankly, it's illegal. If you had that kind of marriage law back then, and Samson wouldn't have even known about it. I mean, he would have had no idea. He would have just thought his wife was waiting for him at her father's house. We go to chapter 15. And in chapter 15 says verse 1, but after a while, and as happens in, fights and problems like this, people cool off. But after a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, this is going to become important here in a little bit. After a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife with a young goat. One of the commentaries says this is the equivalent of having a fight with your wife and then showing up with a box of chocolates. That's it's basically just I love you, I'm sorry we fought, here's a nifty little gift, we'll sort this out. So anyway, he's going to visit, and it still calls the girl his wife, even though she was given to somebody else. So he visited his wife with a young goat, and he said, I will go into my wife into the inner room. But her father would not allow him to go in. Verse 2, her father said, now, in the Hebrew text here is really interesting because when, they didn't have telephones and all that stuff, Samson couldn't call ahead and say, by the way, I'm going to come. So they're all just having their little house thing, and all of a sudden there's Samson there. Just caught them all by surprise. And the father doesn't know how to handle the situation. You may have been in those situations before. I've been in those situations before where something happens and you're like, oh my gosh, how do I handle this? And you kind of stumble over your words, trying to catch yourself. And that's very clearly in the Hebrew text here. The Hebrew text is rocky, to say the least. So the way we've translated it, her father said, well, I said to myself, I said, indeed, I thought. You're like, good grief. What are you trying to say, mister? But it's just choppy because it's reflecting what the man is really going through. He's just like, how do you tell this hulk of a young man in front of you that you gave away his wife? So he's stumbling. I said to myself, I said, indeed, I thought that you hated her. So I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead, which is not really well thought through. It'd be nice if there was some kind of courting, some kind of relationship. You can't just, I'm going to give away my younger daughter, that kind of thing. So you can tell this is kind of stuck together to try to save a situation. I love the fact that it's in the text because it's very real. all of us get caught in that kind of situation at one time or another, where something happens to us that just catches us by surprise. We don't exactly know what to say. We don't exactly know what to do, and we can make stupid mistakes. But anyway, so he ends up offering the girl's younger sister. Verse 3, he said to them, "This time I will be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm." And there's a lot in the phrase, "this time I will be blameless," because the first time he attacked the Philistines was when he killed 30 innocent men to take their clothing. And he may have felt some kind of thing like, well, they're enemies, they're Philistines, but I mean, they didn't do anything specifically against me. And so now he's considering what's going on now, that his wife has been taken from him and given away and that kind of thing. And so he says, "This time I will be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm." And so verse 4, so Samson went and caught 300 jackals and took torches and turned tail to tail and put a torch in the middle between every two tails. And when he'd set the torches on fire, he let them go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the stacked grain and the standing grain, and also the vineyards and the olive trees. Now, the vineyards and the olive trees are not in the same place as the standing grain. The standing grain, you've got these fields, and then off to the side on the hillsides, you have the vineyards and the olive trees. So Samson had to somehow or other, I mean, the logistics of this is ridiculous. I mean, first of all, yeah, if Samson, and this is where we see this extra humor of Samson start to come out, that he's alone, he doesn't have support, and he's leaning on his humor. And so he's going to do something that, yes, it's destructive, but it's also funny. And so he catches 300 jackals, and how you do that is astounding. And jackals, as you know, are a very fierce animal, have a very, very vicious bite. And he took torches and he somehow or other tied the jackals together by their tails. And he put a torch in the middle between every two tails. And then he's going to light the torches and set the jackals free. Now, the jackals don't like the torches being right there at their tails. I mean, so they're obviously going to be upset at that. They also are upset that they can't get away from each other. So they're probably biting pretty close to the base of the torch. They're biting each other. They're running around. So there's this giant zigzag pattern of jackals, 150 pairs of jackals, and they run all over and burn up the Philistines' crops, the grain, the vineyards, and the olive trees. And this again is when Samson was doing this, he's probably thinking, this is going to be really funny to watch. And it probably was, frankly. Not wrong to have a sense of humor, wrong to lean on it too hard. And that's eventually what Samson's going to do. Verse 6, the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" Now, what Samson has done here, even though it would have been fairly local, when he burned up the standing grain, I've been to that valley. I've been to Timnah. Bill and I, this last trip to Israel, we went to Timnah. We got within about 300-400 yards of it. And then we had a flat tire and we had to stop and turn around. But it's, it's in a flat valley where there could be grain around it and that kind of thing, with some hillsides off where there could be vineyards and whatever. And so word of this, even though it was local, got to the larger Philistine body. And so the Philistines said, and what you've got to have here is, this is some of the local rulers and local leaders. And they're saying, "Who has done this?" And watch the answer. They said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite. Now, if the people who are saying this were from Timnah, they simply would have said, Samson, the son-in-law of so-and-so. but they're not from Timnah. And so they call this man a Timnite. And that's important, because what it's doing here is it's introducing the fact that what Samson's doing has now gone beyond Timnah. The greater Philistine body is becoming aware of what Samson is doing. The Philistines said, Philistine leadership, who has done this? And some people answered, Samson-in-law. Samson, he's the son-in-law of that Timnite guy, the guy that lives in Timnah, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines then said, okay, then that family is too much of a problem. They're causing, their personal problems have now become a national problem. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. So they simply said, you're a national problem and we're getting rid of you. And so they killed her off. Verse 7, so Samson responds. So Samson said to them. Now there are some texts that say, so Samson said to himself. And I think that's probably more accurate. He didn't speak to the Philistine rulers. He was talking to himself. He says, since you do things like this, meaning, kill my wife, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, surely I will be avenged of you. And only after that I will stop. Verse 8, and he struck them leg on thigh with a great slaughter. We don't know what that idiom means. It probably means, something like right and left, something like that. He struck them leg on thigh with a great slaughter. He went down and stayed in the cave of the rock of Etam. We're not exactly sure where that was, but it's probably very close to his hometown of Zorah. Yeah. Verse 9, the Philistines went and encamped in Judah and spread themselves out in Lehi. Now, interestingly enough, this is an anachronism. The word Lehi means jawbone, and it wasn't named this until after Samson killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. So when it says they spread themselves out in Lehi, this is written after the event to let you know where they were. And it's because they were in Lehi, and Lehi was named Jawbone because Samson killed a bunch of people with a jawbone. In other words, that's where their army kind of camped. The Philistines went up and encamped in Judah. They spread themselves out. Their camp spread out in Lehi. So they're already there. They're already in Lehi. Verse 10, the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? Well, that's really interesting. The Philistines get the word about Samson. They know who he is. They know what he's doing. They know what kind of problems that his family has caused, and they're going to move against it. But the Israelites are completely ignorant. Why have you come up against us? And again, sometimes the Christians, the believers, are not as spiritually sharp as they should have been. The men of Judah should have had more of a pulse on, or a read on, what was going on spiritually in their country, and they didn't know it. So they say to the Philistines, why have you come up against it? And they said, we've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he's done to us, which basically means kill him, because that's what he had done to them. Verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cave of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? That's an amazing statement. What happened to God's rulership over them? What happened to God being the king, God being their God? These Israelites have completely acquiesced to the world's way of doing things. The Philistines are rulers over us. Sometimes as Christians, we've got to take a stand when the world will keep taking property, taking things from us. You can't say this, you can't do this. And sometimes you just have to speak up and say enough. And that's what these guys should have done. Don't you know the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? They ought to be saying, look what we've done to ourselves. And he answered them very honestly. He said, as they did to me, so I've done to them. They messed with my family and stuff. So verse 12, they said, we've come down to bind you and to give you into the hand of the Philistines, which is, I can't even express how sad this is. Samson said, swear to me that you will not attack me to yourselves. Attack me yourselves. And they spoke saying, no. Now, verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cave of the rock Etam and said to Samson, Gideon took 300 men against an army of 135,000 and won. This army is 10 times as big as the army that Gideon had. And yet they're so cowardly. They have been wrapped in idolatry and sin for so long. They've lost touch with the Spirit of God and the direction of God for so long that 3,000 men don't get that they shouldn't be marching to Samson to capture Samson. They should be marching to Samson and saying, okay, lead us as we attack the Philistines, and we're going to blow them out of this darn valley. And they could have. But instead they're blind and they're cowardly, and that happens to Christians today. They become detached from the Spirit of God, wrapped up in the world, blind and cowardly. So verse 13, they spoke, no, we're going to bind you and give you into their hands, but kill, we will not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Verse 14, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him. And the word shout here, it's hard to translate this. We don't know the exact emphasis of it, but it's used of shouting or crying out, and it's also used of a war cry. And I think literally, Samson had basically attacked them, killed them, burned their stuff. And I think really, they were ready to make war on Samson. And here he came all tied up. So they shouted as they met him. But here's God who steps in. But the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that's been burned with a fire. Now, flax is a candlestick. If you've ever, my wife loves candles, so we have a lot of candles around the house. We like to burn candles when we eat dinner. So when you get through burning the candle, it's got this little black wick. Well, after it cools off and dries out, you know how easy it is to break that wick? You just touch it, it falls off and breaks. I mean, that's flax burned with a fire. That's what, when the Spirit of God moved in Samson, that's what those ropes were like. There was no effort to break those ropes. His bonds melted from off his hands. Verse 15, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and stretched out his hand and took it and struck down 1,000 men with it. And I love the fact that it says it's a fresh jawbone, because if it was a dried old jawbone, it wouldn't stand up to the pounding to kill 1,000 men. And I actually think that probably the donkey was there, that it's not just, I've seen the paintings of Samson, and, there's this kind of sandy soil, and then sticking out of the soil in a nice handy way is this jawbone. I just don't think that's what happened. For it to be and that wouldn't have even been a fresh jawbone. For it to be a fresh jawbone, the donkey would have recently died. And if the donkey recently died, it probably still had some flesh on it, some sinews, some of the flesh that's around the jaw. I think it could very well be that Samson just found a kind of a dead donkey there with his jaw kind of jutting in, and just kind of reached down and said, let me borrow this, and just went and just took it right out of his body. And then he stretched out his hand and took it and used that as a weapon to kill 1,000 men. And again, that's the Spirit of God. It says the Spirit of God rushed on him, and he did that under the influence of God's Spirit. And then verse 16, now we see his humor again. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. Ha, ha, ha. He got the humor of that. A bloody mess, the being killed with a jawbone of a donkey cut with the teeth and that kind of thing. But he's gonna take the time. Again, there's nobody with him. He's standing alone. It's him and God. So he just makes this little poem, verse 17. And it came to pass when he'd finished speaking that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi, which is the lifting up of the jawbone. And that's exactly what Samson did to engage that fight. Verse 18, and he was thirsty and called on Yahweh and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servants. So who does Samson credit? Yahweh. You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. And he calls himself the servant of the Lord. He knew when he was walking by the Spirit. And now, will I die for thirst and fall into the hands of these uncircumcised? Verse 19, so God split open the hollow place that's in Lehi, and water came out of it. God just simply, made a spring and water came out. And when he drank, his spirit, meaning his energy, came again, and he revived. Therefore, its name was called En Hakor, the caller's spring, if you will, the spring of the one who calls, which is in Lehi to this day. Verse 20, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So again, we see that Samson is the one that God says is the judge, despite the fact he's standing alone. When we have the Spirit of God, and when we walk by that Spirit, we have great authority in the eyes of God. And we've got to believe that. And the world would like to dismember us from that authority. Oh, you're just a person. Oh, who are you to say these things? But when we walk by the Spirit of God, we have the authority of God. And Samson, maybe nobody did come to him in 20 years to get advice, but he was the judge in that time period, and the scripture testifies to it. So this is as far as I'm going to go tonight, and then next time we'll go to chapter 16, and we will finish the Samson record, and that'll be the Tuesday after July 4th. So thank you all for your attention, and God bless all of you.